Hi. Chapter 11 of the book Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood is done by R Schreiner. He was introduced in video number 19 of this series on biblical manhood and womanhood. This chapter is called The Valuable Ministries of Women in Context of Male Leadership, a survey of Old and New Testament examples and teaching. Schreiner divides the material into 6 areas. These are the 6 areas. 1. Prophetesses. 2. Women teachers and spiritual gifts. 3. Women as fellow workers and laborers. 4. Women deacons. 5. Women elders. 6. Women apostles. He begins first giving the feminist position for full inclusion of all ministries, and then he gives his response as one who says there are some restrictions on women in ministry. I'm only going to read from 2 of these categories. The first one in this video and the second one the next time. This one dealing with women as fellow workers and laborers. So the feminist position is presented this way. He mentions, as it has already been noted that in Romans 16:3, Paul calls Priscilla a fellow worker. Then he lists lots of names of male fellow workers, and then he continues by pointing out, moreover, Priscilla is not the only woman whom Paul calls a fellow worker. In Philippians 4:2, he exhorts 2 women, Euodia and Syntyche, to agree in the Lord. In 4:3, he says that they struggled together with him in the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of the fellow workers. The implication is that Euodia and Syntyche, I don't know if I say this right, were fellow workers. They struggled together in the gospel by helping Paul spread the good news of salvation. Then he has in 1 Corinthians 6:16, Paul exhorts the Corinthians to be subject to the house of Stephanas and to every fellow worker and laborer. We have already seen the 3 women are called fellow workers, Priscilla, Euodia, and Syntyche. Paul says that the Corinthians are to be subject to all fellow workers and laborers. It would seem to follow, according to those who reject any limits on women today, that since Priscilla and the other 2 women were fellow workers, these women held leadership positions in the church, and therefore men were subject to them. It is also noted that Paul says to be subject to every laborer, as well as every fellow worker. Paul often describes his ministry using the same word for labor. And then he lists the references to that. Indeed, the work of other leaders is also described in terms of laboring. The Corinthians are to submit to the house of Stephanas, who labors for them. The Thessalonians are exhorted to respect those who work hard or labor among you. And these are clearly the leaders, because Paul goes on to say that they are over you in the Lord and admonish you. The elders who rule well should receive double honor, according to 1 Timothy 5:17. Especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. Clearly then, Paul often uses the verb labor to denote authoritative ministry and instruction. But Paul also mentions women who have labored. In Romans 16:6, he instructs the Romans to greet Mary, who labored much for them. And in Romans 16:12, 3 women, more difficult names, Tryphena and Tryphosa and Persis, are said to have labored in the Lord. Some conclude, therefore, that women were leaders in the congregations, for the word labor is clearly used in this sense in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 Thessalonians 5:12, and in 1 Timothy 5:17. So that's the feminist position presented. Now we will look at the response that's given from a position that holds to the idea that women have some restrictions. So this is the response. Several texts were cited above that spoke of women being fellow workers and laborers. Since these terms are often used of men who exercise leadership, and since in 1 Corinthians 16:16 the church is called to submit to such, it was inferred that women had leadership positions in the church. But this argument is only convincing if these words are technical terms for positions of leadership, and it is not clear that the terms are technical. That women played a significant role in gospel ministry is clear from the use of these terms, but it is unwarranted to derive from these terms alone the nature of their ministry. The terms fellow worker and laborer are vague. There are many ways that women could have been fellow workers and laborers without holding leadership positions over men. The clear teaching of Paul elsewhere, 1 Corinthians 11:2-16, 14:33-36, and 1 Timothy 2:11-15, must be the guide for understanding the role of women, rather than the appeal to terms that are too vague to support the idea of women sharing full leadership with men. Women could, for example, be prophets and probably deacons without violating male leadership, and yet surely such women should be fellow workers and would be fellow workers and laborers. Okay, he also says the word fellow worker and laborer do not indicate that someone is a church leader, although that does not mean that these terms are never used of church leaders. All church leaders would be fellow workers and laborers, but not all fellow workers and laborers are necessarily church leaders. Some may conclude that the reference to the household of Stephanas shows that women must be included. This argument, however, proves too true. Surely no one would say that the children in Stephanas' house were church leaders, and yet they were part of his house. Those who want to prove that women held positions of authority over men must prove their case with arguments from indisputable examples, rather than from vague wording that Paul uses here. Okay, so the next time I will just look at his section about apostles, women as apostles, and the two sides, the feminist position, how they argue, and how Schreiner argues. This time I'm going to link to two videos. The first one, a New Testament example of a worker, Tabitha, commended for good deeds and gifts of mercy. And the second one, a more modern day example, although it seems very old now. Elizabeth Fry, The Effect of Christianity on Women in Prison. So, prison ministry of Elizabeth Fry. Thanks for watching.